Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Shirley Hoekstra. We've all met people who have lost their jobs because of the bottom line, an unchallenged concept. And successful businesses are vital to flourishing communities. So how do people and profit fit together? Hear more today on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Jeff Van Duzer, Dean of the School of Business and Economics at Seattle Pacific University and author of the book, Why Business Matters to God and What Still Needs to Be Fixed. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you. Great to be here.
There's a lot of discussion about the bottom line being so important in business, and everybody just accepts that, yep, we got to just have the best bottom line. Should we be accepting that?
Well, in one sense, sure. If you don't pay attention to the bottom line, you won't be around to be in business very long. What I think probably needs to be nuanced a little bit is we need to think about the bottom line in a broader context. And profitability or return on investment needs to serve a bigger end. And in this case, I think to serve the end of having business effectively serve our communities.
Yeah, because when you just look at the bottom line, especially in economic hard times, you can have to fire people. You might have to make your product a little bit smaller or a little less effective. So how does that serve the community when you're making those decisions?
There's no single simple answer to that because, I mean, sometimes you do need to downsize and sometimes you need to right-size your product to fit the market to make it more usable for the market. There's some wonderful stories about folks taking big boxes of soap and breaking them down into tiny little baggie size for sales in developing world countries because that's the package that they could afford. So it's not a simple answer. The question in my mind is usually though, what is it that you're looking at? What's your ultimate goal in pursuing this? Profitability is a very important and essential tool. But is it the only thing you're about, or is it a tool to something bigger, which is what I think it should be?
You write about the fact that the philosophy that you're talking about is based on God's design for business. Could you talk a little bit about how you know what God's design is for business?
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't claim to know, but the approach we took was to look at Scripture and to look at really the big story of Scripture, not individual verses. There's a handful of individual verses about business that you could peel out, but it strikes me those are very thin threads out of which to make a whole fabric. So we looked at the big story. We took it apart in movements: creation, fall, redemption, new creation, and then we began to ask, what do each of those have to tell us about business? And so as we looked particularly at the creation account and what God would have intended from the outset, what we ended up beginning to draw out were a couple of purposes that he had for humanity that would be well served, or for which the institution of business is right now really situated to deliver on.
So in the fall, what happened to this market economy that made human beings so self-interested?
Yeah, I guess to me, the centerpiece of the fall was humanity's unwillingness to live as originally designed as creatures that would exist within limits. At the very center of the garden, and I think it's important that it's at the center, is the only tree that they're not to eat from. But it signifies that at their very core, that at the center of who they weren't God. They were limited creatures. And so the temptation, of course, was, as the serpent said, to be like God. And so they, as you know the story, ended up eating the fruit. And what that did is it destroyed the shalom, it destroyed the harmony of the garden. And so every dimension, include human God, human natural order, human work, all of that gets distorted as a result of the unwillingness to be limited creatures. And so whatever intentions God might have set up in the garden end up getting severely distorted through that act. And that's really why we see now so many business failures, so many really awful things that business has occasion to do from time to time.
In fact, you write about the fact that the sprint of our work lives isn't able to be continued.
Yeah.
In this sprint part of this not accepting limits?
Yeah, because originally there was this design of a kind of rhythm of work and rest in a fairly natural, harmonious balance. And we've totally lost that as a society. I mean, it's a 24/7, go as fast as you can, as long as you can kind of business world.
So what are the bad effects of that in terms of coworkers, in terms of how we set up society, and when you always have to go, go, go?
There are lots of negative effects. A couple that have personally impacted me is I lose the capacity to reflect. When you're squeezing more and more into every minute, you're squeezing something out, and what you're squeezing out is the capacity to stop and think. Am I pleased with the direction am I going? Am I doing what I think is the right thing to do? You're just going too fast to hear that. The other thing that for me personally is I get on a kind of adrenaline buzz that makes it very hard to sit still. And so it makes it very hard to pray because I can't be quiet long enough to connect. And so I think there are a number of reasons why Sabbath or rhythms of work and rest are really essential to our lives today, and really contrary to the spirit of the time.
When you talk about the purpose of businesses under this God's design concept, the first one was to serve the community, and the second one was to help employees flourish and be creative. Yeah. Do you think that that's happening more or less today, this idea of employees flourishing?
Happily, there is a greater attentiveness to this in just the broader business literature, and you'll find in a lot of business schools there'll be more attention to this, perhaps in large part driven by, if we keep them happier, they will work harder and longer and we'll make more money. But still, I think there is a greater willingness to look at what does it mean to enable employees to find fulfillment in their work, not just through their work, in effect.
So there are employees who feel meaning in their work when they have the ability to affect something about their work, right? And this idea of having the top-down theory is changing some. Do you have examples of where employees are more involved with the decision-making?
Oh, there's a lovely book, The Joy of Work, by a guy named Dennis Bakke, who talks about his time at AES, energy trading company. He tells stories about how he would radically delegate down the line. He said in his view the CEO should make no more than 1 or 2 decisions a year. So he would empower local folks on the ground to make decisions about their budget and so forth. It was a pretty radical extension of this model, but I do think across the board you're seeing this emphasis on decentralization. I mean, there's a lot of business reasons totally apart from why you care about people, reasons that is motivating that, but the net effect of it, I think, is often quite good.
You also think that wage disparities are actually part of the oppression that the Bible spoke against.
I'm not sure I would quite agree with that statement. I'm totally okay with wage disparities in the sense that the market will provide different values and different incentives and different contributions. What I think I'm concerned about is what many people are concerned about is the growing disparity between rich and poor. And I am concerned for a variety of reasons. One of them is that it makes it it creates worlds where people don't know each other. It used to be in a manufacturing environment, the CEO could come down and walk the floor of the plant and know the people and know a little bit about their families. And so there was still, even though there might be a wage disparity, there was still a greater sense of a shared community, particularly in high-tech worlds where people are sitting behind computer screens and often in remote locations. There is this kind of growing gap between worker and boss, and that is aggravated by growing disparities in wealth.
Do you think that also reflects the fact that sometimes those people in upper management sort of feel like they deserve a particular wage? Now, it's true that there's pressure and burdens and responsibilities and things like that, but what if you just paid the workers more and shared the profit margin in a different way? How would that sort of affect the way in which business operated?
I think you can do that to some extent and should do it. I think it would send signals to employees that they're valued members of the community. If you get too far afield from that, what you end up having because of market forces is an inability to attract upper management. So it's not easy to, in a broken world, to fully implement some of the underlying principles and desires that might have come out of God's perfect design. But we're called to sort of push toward them as we can.
Okay, so I hear you talking completely about trade-offs. There's always this balancing, measuring, reflecting trade-offs. So how do you know when you have maybe two competing goods, right? There's not one big evil decision and one better. How should a business person reflect on those competing goods?
You know, I talk a little bit about this in the book, although I do cast it more as, choosing lesser of two evils. And I think that's one of the most interesting questions that is out there right now, and actually surprisingly one that I don't see a great deal of help coming from the church. There isn't. What I've discovered is the church is pretty good about saying this is a good and this is a good, and not so good about saying this is the better good in this particular or here's. It's a case by case, I think, and there are things that help. Spiritual disciplines.
What do you mean by spiritual disciplines?
Well, for example, a regular daily moment of pausing and praying. A community. My wife and I are a member of a small group that meets once a week and has done so for 20-some years now, 30-some years now, actually. And so there aren't many decisions I'll make that have any consequence that I won't process with the small group. Some things even like fasting on a regular basis as a way of just kind of creating a new rhythm and a new space. All of these, I think, are like tilling the ground.
Makes you ready for a big decision.
Exactly. You create a fertile soil so that you can listen well and respond to whatever prompting you think the Spirit or God is bringing in the circumstance.
What it sounds like you're saying is that you're not sort of having a duality, that I've got my spiritual life over here and I've got my work life over here.
Exactly. And I think that is actually a very significant danger for Christians in business, that we tend to think of these kinds of decisions, personal decisions, like should I be kind, or how should I talk to so-and-so? These we might easily think, well, God would have something to say about that. But when I get to what price should I set for that product, or should I merge? Many Christians in business, I think, end up saying, well, that's just business. That's nothing to do with God. And that is exactly that dangerous dualism. And I do think it is critically important that we bring God into all of the dimensions of the business life.
You talk about getting together then with like-minded people. Now, personally, you have this discipleship group that but what about business owners? Does it help for them to be in any kind of organizations where they're not the Lone Ranger? Because there's a fear that if I'm going to make these kind of decisions, maybe based on biblical principles, I might get out of my profit margin. I might lose my edge. And it always is sort of like a cutthroat sense for business.
Yeah, actually, I think there are many such groups, and they're very helpful and very important. And one of the advantages is that often in those kind of contexts, you can find people who can more quickly understand the nuances of the challenge that you're facing. And there's some wonderful, there's actually been some case studies written about these groups and how they have affected each other. One of the challenges is to be vulnerable at a business level with other business leaders.
Sure.
Both because egos are often very much on the line, but also for fear that you're perhaps not honoring your own company and so on. But the ones that really work best get past that and are able to share quite openly and freely. Here's what I'm struggling with. Here's where I think I screwed up. What should I do differently? And those are some of the things that I think.
How would I find such a group?
There are various associations of CEOs or business leaders. I'm familiar with some of the ones that are very active in Seattle, but there are both some national organizations and a lot of regional ones get set up. So I probably nothing more than Googling, Christians in business, and you'd probably end up finding some references to these.
Sometimes in church, though, the sense is that there are other things that are better professions, better, right, more Christian ministries, and that business is maybe one that if you have to do it, right? Yeah. And so this kind of creates that dualism in a way too. But how do you see business serving actually the re-emerging of the original design?
Well, I mean that's really in a sense at the heart of the book is acknowledging that God has an agenda for our world, And different institutions are better situated to support different aspects of that agenda. But that there are some pieces of things that God cares a great deal about that business is ideally situated for. So specifically, the two that I highlight is business exists to provide goods and services that will enable the community to flourish. Business is actually the only institution in society that actually creates economic value. There are any number of other institutions that create other kinds of value that business draws down on, so I'm not saying that business is king, but as to economic value, it's really the institution that generates that. And so, and that matters to God. That's what feeds people. That's what cares for health needs. That's the way in which predominantly God provides for the needs of His people. So I think Christians need to be reinvigorated around a richer understanding that what they're doing, not just the money they're earning and giving to the church so the church can go do God's work, but that actually their work in and of itself is advancing God's kingdom. And so that's one part, is the products and services. The other part is to create those meaningful and creative jobs. That we were designed as human beings to express aspects of our identity in work.
Yeah, Jim Collins writes in Good to Great about business finding their economic engine and how this economic engine can do so much good actually in society. And if we thought as businessmen and women that the economic engine was serving this recreation of our world.
Participating in the redemption work that God is doing and carrying forth the creation mandate that's been given to us from the beginning.
You talk about sustainability as part of this, right? And caring for our world is more and more urgent, seems to me. And how do you see business operating in this sustainability model, which is more than just caring for the environment?
Yeah, so if you say, here's the purpose of business. Business exists to serve, and to serve in these couple of key ways. You also have to ask, what are sort of the boundary conditions or the limits on that business must respect as it pursues these service purposes? Because not everything you do, even in service of the right purpose, would end up being right. And so the boundary conditions that we've ended up thinking about have been the notion of sustainability, but not just as we will typically use it in the United States of sort of environmental sustainability, but sustainability across all the dimensions of the business.
Give me some examples.
Well, simple example with vis-a-vis shareholders. So in my view, a business cannot take the capital that a shareholder invests and not pay a reasonable risk-adjusted rate of return, because otherwise that's taking something, running through it, using it up, and it's not long-term sustainable. Similarly, as say to employees, this is why I think Christians should be at the front end of the living wage movement in our country, because you can't take the full productive capacity of an individual and not pay him or her enough to live on, because that is not sustainable. And you can think about that from what it means for customers and sort of incessant advertising, creating this constant hunger for more. I mean, there's a variety of ways that you can use the notion of sustainability to begin to think, how could I keep doing this indefinitely, assuming that the outside world didn't change, in a way that really respects the integrity of each of these different constituent groups?
I never thought about sustainability as it came to advertising, because anybody who watches the Super Bowl at some point or any other kind of mega event on television, it's just advertising, and you almost get weary.
Yes, indeed.
And you're talking about having some limits, something that would make that more sustainable on a human level.
That's right. That would be one description of boundary conditions. And another one that one might play with, which I don't really go into as much, you might think about human dignity. And what does it mean to conduct business, always mindful of the human dignity of each of these different constituent groups.
One of the chief complaints of small business owners, and maybe other institutions as well, is that the government continually tries to regulate. And they would say, businesses, it's just going to add costs, and I have to really fight all of these regulations. You in the book see regulations in a slightly different way, not quite so evil.
Well, a lot of times I'll give talks on something like this, and even if I'll say nothing at all about the subject, invariably there'll be somebody at the end of will raise their hand and say, well, what do you think about regulation?
Right.
But I always feel like saying, well, what a stupid question. I mean, what do you think about car? You like some, you don't like others. The problem I have with the debate around regulation is it's not adequately nuanced. Nobody.
So snippets always.
Yeah, and nobody, not even your most vibrant free market person, doesn't want any government regulation. We need government to protect private property, to ensure that we have courts that we can adjudicate contract rights. I mean, so at one level, it's all a matter of degree. And I don't know anybody anywhere that thinks a socialist, totally government-driven economy is good. I don't know anybody that thinks a total free market without any government involvement is good. And so it's kind of where you draw the line. And there are places where it seems to me government, and anytime you pass a regulation, it's inherently over and under inclusive.
Oh, that's an interesting thing to think about, over and under inclusive, isn't it?
Yeah, you can't, because you're dealing with specific facts, you can't have a single rule that applies perfectly. So it always comes with some cost that is unintended. And the question is trade-offs. Is that cost better than, is it worth paying that cost to get some improvement in behavior that's good for all of society? There are, I mean, sometimes I'm kind of in a snide mood. I'm not terribly sympathetic for some of this, because some of the regulations that we really don't need, but have been driven because business has not taken care of its own business. Business has behaved badly. And if business had done the right thing, it would have known to have done the right thing, nobody would have had to come along and say, okay, from now on you have to file 7 reports indicating that you've done the right thing. So to some extent, business has brought some of this on itself. On the other hand, all institutions try to take more territory. That's just inherent in their nature.
Well, this is the unsustainability part. This is the without limits, right? Let me intrude on another area if I can, right?
Yeah.
And justified perhaps by more profits.
Right.
There's an opportunity, I'm going to go for it.
But government also does the same thing. So government as an institution is also always trying to take more territory. It's just endemic to the nature of these things. And so it clearly overreaches at times. There are clearly some bad regulations that would be better to be taken off the books.
So what do we do if we think there's an overreaching regulation, or if we think there's greed in business?
Well, I mean, I think when I speak to business leaders, I say, look, God intended these institutions to coexist, and rather than seeing them as adversaries, which is always the way in which this is presented, they were intended originally to be allies in service of a common good. And so in what is government supposed to be about, and how can you as a business help government get better at what it's supposed to do? And when I talk to folks in government, it's the opposite. You know, business is supposed to be about some things. How can you in government help them be better at it? Not control them, but help them actually internally, intrinsically, be better at doing what they're supposed to be about.
So in some ways, Christians should have a moderate approach that allows them to be hinge, because we have a different perspective. We're not driven by a single perspective, but by a whole.
That's right. I think Christians, but you could take this more broadly, people who are interested in the common good of society should appreciate that all institutions have a role to play. And really the question is, how are you going to put these together? And I don't mean to suggest that we will all agree on where the line should be drawn, but rather than always approaching this as a fight, couldn't we approach this in some respect of how can we each enable the other institution to do better?
You talk about employees having an impact on their businesses, even if they're not in a management spot or an upper management where they're making actually decisions about philosophy or direction. And how would you expect a person who is part of an organization, but maybe at an entry level or a lower level spot, advancing the priorities that we've talked about today?
Yeah, I get this. My students will tell me, they'll say, Jeff, we love your business philosophy, and someday when I'm CEO of Boeing, that's what we'll do. But right now I'm just going to go in as the entry-level guy. What I always say is, look, there's certain things you can do from the minute you walk in the door, and you should always do. And those are your sort of personal behaviors. Your act with integrity, do solid work, care for the people around you. And this stuff matters tremendously to God, and it gets noticed. So you can do that regardless of what position in the company you are. But as it relates to these sort of themes that I've been driving from the book, I say, look, it's true. As an entry-level person, you're not going to redirect the purpose of this in a large corporation. But what you do is you lean into whatever opportunities are given you. And what has always amazed me is that 2 or 3 years after our undergraduates graduate, they're out and they're leading teams. I mean, you know, not necessarily big teams, not the bet the company sort of teams, but teams. And as soon as you're leading a team, you can start asking questions. How can I make this work more meaningful and creative for my team? You can look for situations where, hey, you know, if we did it this way, we could still accomplish the company's goals, but we might be actually doing a little bit better for our community. And those kinds of things are more available than I think people anticipate for those kind of entry-level positions. So
and you even give an example of a grocery bagger.
Yeah. They sort of, this wasn't actually my example. It was a fellow named Don Flo who told this story, but was a woman who for many, many years simply bagged groceries, but she saw that as her sphere of influence, and so she reached out to customers and found out about their families and prayed for them in difficult situations. And apparently when she died, had a huge memorial service because all these people wanted to come and honor her. But all she did was live into the space that God had given her.
Thank you. My guest today has been Jeff Van Duzer, Dean of the School of Business and Economics at Seattle Pacific University, and author of Why Business Matters to God and What Still Needs to Be Fixed. I'm Shirley Hoekstra, and thank you for watching Inner Compass.